The quiet suburban neighborhood of West Maple seemed like the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Rows of neat, identical houses lined the streets, their manicured lawns trimmed to perfection. The air was filled with the scent of freshly mown grass and the faint hum of sprinklers ticking rhythmically in the distance. But for all its charm, the neighborhood wasn't without its quirks. Beneath its picturesque surface, there was a quiet divide, an unspoken tension between its older residents who clung to the neighborhood's past and the newer, younger families who were reshaping it into something more vibrant. James Walker lived in one of the older homes near the edge of the neighborhood. His house, with its peeling paint and cluttered porch, stood out among the pristine surroundings. James was a man of habits. At 52, he had retired early from a monotonous office job, retreating into a life of solitude. His days were predictable: a cup of black coffee at dawn, a crossword puzzle in the afternoon, and evenings spent watching old westerns on his aging TV. He liked his world quiet, and that's how he'd kept it for years. But lately, things had begun to change. Across the street from James's house was a small park with a basketball court. Over the past few weeks, a group of kids, mostly between 10 and 12 years old, had made the court their second home. Their laughter echoed through the street as they shot hoops and played pickup games, their sneakers squeaking against the concrete. To James, it was chaos. On a warm Saturday afternoon, James sat on his porch, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and frowning at the park. The kids were louder than usual. They shouted to each other as they played, their laughter ringing out in bursts that grated on his nerves. James shifted in his chair, trying to focus on his crossword puzzle, but the noise was relentless. His gaze lingered on the kids, a mix of boys and girls with mismatched basketballs and worn sneakers. Some of them had rolled up socks and grass-stained shirts, their faces flushed with the excitement of the game. To anyone else, they would have seemed harmless, just kids being kids. But James couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't belong. "They're getting too comfortable," he muttered to himself. Setting the crossword aside, he leaned back in his chair, glaring at the group. This isn't a playground. The truth was, it wasn't just the noise. It was the way the neighborhood felt different now. More families were moving in, families who didn't look like the people James had grown up around. He didn't know these kids or their parents, and something about their carefree attitude made him uncomfortable. James stood up, walking into his house and letting the screen door slam shut behind him. He grabbed his phone from the counter, his fingers hovering over the keypad. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. "They're just kids," he thought, but another voice whispered back, "But they're loud, and they're taking over." Before he could stop himself, James dialed the non-emergency line for the police. "West Maple Police Department," a calm voice answered. "What's the nature of your call?" James cleared his throat. Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance. There's a group of kids at the park across from my house. They've been making noise all afternoon, and it's getting out of hand." There was a pause on the other end. "Are they engaging in any illegal activity?" "No," James admitted, "but they're rowdy. I don't think they're from around here." The operator's tone remained professional, but there was a hint of skepticism. "We'll send an officer to check it out." James hung up, his hands trembling slightly. He felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. He hoped the kids would quiet down, but a part of him also knew this might not go as smoothly as he imagined. The kids were still playing when the first police car rolled into the neighborhood. The sound of the siren startled them, and they froze mid-game, their basketball bouncing away and coming to rest near the curb. Two officers stepped out of the car, their expressions unreadable. "Hey, kids," one of the officers called, his voice firm but not harsh. "What's going on here?" "We're just playing basketball," said Tyler, the oldest of the group. His voice wavered slightly, but he stood his ground. "Is there a problem?" The officer looked at his partner, who shrugged. "We got a call about a disturbance. Do you kids live around here?" Tyler hesitated. He and his friends lived a few blocks away, but the court was the only place nearby where they could play. "We're just visiting. We come here all the time." The officers exchanged a glance, then started asking more questions. Names, addresses, what they were doing at the park. The kids answered nervously, their earlier excitement replaced by confusion and fear. James watched from his porch, his stomach knotting as the scene unfolded. He hadn't expected this. The officers weren't being aggressive, but the sight of flashing lights and the kids' uneasy expressions made James feel uneasy himself. Then, a car pulled into James's driveway, a sleek sedan that seemed out of place next to his aging pickup truck. Out stepped Hannah Reed, James's daughter, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. Hannah hadn't seen her father in months. Their relationship had been strained for years, and she had only come by to drop off some paperwork. But as she stepped out of her car, she saw the police cars, the officers, and the group of frightened kids on the court. Her heart sank. "What the hell is going on here?" she muttered under her breath. Hannah stormed up the driveway, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. When she reached the porch, she turned to James, her voice low but full of anger. "Dad, what did you do?" James blinked at her, startled. I called them. The kids were making too much noise." Hannah's eyes widened in disbelief. She turned away from him, striding toward the officers without hesitation. "Excuse me," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "What's going on here?" The officers explained the call, their tone shifting slightly as they recognized her professional demeanor. Hannah was a social worker and had dealt with situations like this before. She quickly de-escalated the situation, assuring the officers that the kids weren't causing any harm and that the complaint was unfounded. Reluctantly, the officers nodded and returned to their car. As the kids resumed their game, still shaken but relieved, Hannah turned back to James. Her expression was a mix of anger and disappointment. "We need to talk," she said. James nodded silently, his throat dry. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he'd done. James sat in his worn armchair, staring at the faded wallpaper in his living room. The air felt heavy, thick with the tension from Hannah's pointed silence as she stood by the window. Arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her jaw was clenched, and her gaze was distant, as though she was trying to process what she had just witnessed. Finally, she spoke, her voice cold and clipped. "Do you even understand what you just did?" James shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. I just wanted some peace and quiet," he muttered. "They were being too loud. I didn't mean for it to." "To what? For the police to show up and interrogate a group of kids?" Hannah snapped, cutting him off. "Dad, those kids were just playing basketball. Do you know how much worse this could have gone?" James looked away, unable to meet her piercing gaze. He felt a wave of defensiveness rise in his chest, but it was quickly overtaken by shame. "I didn't think it'd be a big deal," he mumbled. "They didn't look like they belonged here." Hannah's eyes widened, and she let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "There it is," she said. "They didn't look like they belonged here. Do you even hear yourself?" James stayed silent, his face flushing with embarrassment. Hannah took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "You've always been like this, judging people from a distance, assuming the worst without knowing anything about them. Do you know what those kids are going to remember about today? That someone called the cops on them just for existing. And worse, it could have gone sideways. Dad, you've seen the news." The room fell into a strained silence. James could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to respond but found he had nothing to say. What could he say? She was right, and deep down, he knew it. Hannah finally turned toward him, her expression softening slightly but still firm. "You need to think about this. Really think, because this isn't just about today. This is about how you see the world and how you've let it shape your actions. And it needs to change." That night, James sat alone at the kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He couldn't stop replaying the events of the day in his mind, the flashing lights, the confused faces of the kids, and the disappointed look in Hannah's eyes. He had been wrong, there was no denying it now. But what hit him the hardest was the realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. He had spent years building walls around himself, keeping his distance from people who didn't fit into his narrow view of the world. And now, those walls were crumbling. James sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He thought about his relationship with Hannah. They had always been close when she was younger. But as she grew older and became more vocal about social issues, they had drifted apart. He hadn't understood her passion for helping others, and she hadn't understood his need for quiet and order. Now, he wondered if his resistance to her ideals had been rooted in more than just stubbornness. As the night wore on, James resolved to do something. He didn't know what yet, but he couldn't let things stay the way they were. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of a desire to change. The next morning, James stood on his porch, watching the basketball court across the street. The kids were back, their laughter and chatter carrying through the crisp morning air. He hesitated for a long moment, then took a deep breath and walked across the street. As he approached the court, the kids noticed him and stopped playing. They stood in a loose circle, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. James felt his palms sweat as he cleared his throat. Hey there, he began awkwardly. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened yesterday. I shouldn't have called the police. It was a mistake. The kids exchanged glances, and a boy with a serious expression stepped forward. It was Tyler, the oldest of the group. Why'd you do it? He asked, his tone calm but direct. We weren't doing anything wrong. James shifted uncomfortably. I don't know, he admitted. I was annoyed, I guess. And he stopped, realizing how weak his excuses sounded. It doesn't matter why. What matters is that I was wrong. And I'm sorry. The kids stayed silent for a moment. Then Tyler shrugged. Okay, he said simply, but his tone was cautious. And James could tell the apology hadn't erased the damage. As he walked back to his house, James felt a pang of disappointment. He had hoped the apology would make things better. But he realized now that it wasn't that simple. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. Later that afternoon, Hannah called James. She had left abruptly the day before, needing time to cool off and process what had happened. Now, as she listened to her father recount his awkward apology to the kids, she felt a mix of frustration and cautious optimism. I'm glad you apologized, she said finally. But it's not enough. Dad, it's a start, but you need to do more. Actions speak louder than words. James sighed. I don't know where to start. Hannah, I've lived this way for so long, how do I even begin to change? Hannah paused. Then her voice softened. It's not about changing overnight. It's about taking small steps. Listen to people, learn from them, and when you mess up, and you will, own it and try to do better. James nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Okay, he said quietly. I'll try. James woke up the next morning feeling restless. Hannah's words from their conversation echoed in his mind. Actions speak louder than words. He wasn't entirely sure what she meant, but he knew it was time to step outside his comfort zone. For years, he had avoided his neighbors, content to keep his distance and live in solitude. Now, that isolation felt like a barrier he needed to break. He stared out the window at the basketball court. The kids weren't there yet, but he could still hear their laughter in his mind, a reminder of the mistake that had brought everything crashing down. James decided he needed to do something concrete, something that showed he was serious about making amends. He started by walking over to the local library. James hadn't been to the library in years. As he pushed open the heavy glass door, the quiet hum of activity inside felt almost overwhelming. Rows of books stretched out before him, and the scent of paper and ink was both familiar and foreign. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose, greeted him with a polite smile. Can I help you find something? James hesitated. He felt out of place, unsure of what he was even looking for. Yeah, he said finally. Do you have anything on? I don't know. Understanding other people? Maybe something about, bias? The librarian raised an eyebrow but nodded. We have a great section on social issues and personal growth, she said, motioning for him to follow her. She led him to a row of shelves and began pulling down books. This one's about recognizing unconscious bias, she said, handing him a slim volume with a brightly colored cover. And this one focuses on building empathy. James left the library with a small stack of books. As he walked home, he felt an unfamiliar mix of anticipation and dread. He wasn't sure what he would learn, but he knew it was something he needed to do. That evening, James settled into his armchair with one of the books. It was called The Blind Spot: Understanding Unconscious Bias. The first chapter described how people's assumptions and judgments were often shaped by things they weren't even aware of: upbringing, culture, media. James found himself nodding along, though it wasn't easy to admit how much it resonated with his own behavior. Halfway through the chapter, he put the book down and sighed. The words were stirring something uncomfortable in him. He thought about the assumptions he'd made about the kids on the basketball court. He didn't know their names, their families, or anything about them, yet he had judged them as outsiders, as a problem. But another part of him resisted. It's not like I'm a bad person, he thought. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Still, the image of Tyler and the other kids, standing nervously under the gaze of the police, wouldn't leave his mind. A few days later, Hannah stopped by unexpectedly. James was surprised to see her, but he was also grateful. He had been thinking about their conversation and wanted to share what he'd been doing. I went to the library, he said as she stepped inside. Picked up some books about bias and stuff. Hannah raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Really? Yeah, James said, his tone defensive. I've been reading them. It's interesting. Hannah sat down on the couch, crossing her legs. And what have you learned so far? James hesitated. That I've been wrong about a lot of things, he admitted. I didn't realize how much my own assumptions were shaping the way I see people. I think I've been carrying around a lot of prejudice. Hannah's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. That's a good start, Dad, but understanding isn't enough. You need to act on it. James nodded. I know. I don't know how. Hannah leaned forward, her tone gentle but insistent. Get involved. Talk to people. Listen, there's a community meeting at the youth center tomorrow night. You should come. James hesitated. The idea of walking into a room full of strangers and admitting his shortcomings made his stomach churn. But he also knew Hannah was right. If he wanted to change, he had to take the first step. The next evening, James found himself standing outside the youth center, his palms sweating. The building was bustling with activity. Parents, kids, and community leaders were filtering inside, their voices blending into a lively hum. James took a deep breath and stepped through the doors. Inside, the meeting was already underway. A woman at the front of the room was speaking about the challenges facing local youth, limited resources, systemic barriers, and the importance of creating safe spaces for kids to grow and thrive. James slid into a seat at the back, hoping to go unnoticed, but as he listened, something began to shift. The stories being shared were raw and honest, painting a picture of a community that was struggling but resilient. He heard about kids balancing school with part-time jobs to help their families, about parents working 2 or 3 shifts just to make ends meet, about neighbors banding together to support one another. For the first time, James realized how little he truly understood about the people around him. After the meeting, James lingered by the door, unsure if he should stay or leave. As he debated, a man in his late 30s approached him. He was tall, with a warm smile and a firm handshake. Hey, I'm Marcus's dad, the man said. I saw you sitting in the back. First time here? Yeah, James admitted. I wanted to learn more about what's going on in the neighborhood. The man nodded, his smile never wavering. That's good. We need more folks like you getting involved. It makes a difference. James hesitated, then blurted out, I think I've been part of the problem. The man's expression grew thoughtful. We've all made mistakes, he said. What matters is what you do after. If you're here, it means you're trying. That's a start. As James walked home that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was finally ready to take the steps needed to make things right. The following week, James found himself back at the youth center. This time not as a silent observer but as a volunteer. Hannah had arranged for him to meet Ms. Carter, the center's coordinator, a woman in her early 40s with an energy that seemed boundless. She greeted James with a wide smile and a firm handshake. Hannah told me you're looking to get more involved, she said, her eyes twinkling with a mix of curiosity and warmth. We can always use an extra set of hands around here. James nodded, feeling both nervous and out of his depth. I don't have much experience with, any of this, but I'm willing to help however I can. Ms. Carter's smile widened. That's all we ask. Let me show you around. Over the next hour, James was introduced to the ins and outs of the center. Kids of all ages filled the space, playing games, doing homework, or just hanging out. The atmosphere was lively, buzzing with a sense of community that James hadn't experienced in years. Let's start you off easy, Ms. Carter said, handing him a clipboard. We're hosting a basketball tournament next month, and we need someone to organize the schedule. Think you can handle that? James hesitated, then nodded. I'll do my best. Over the next few weeks, James threw himself into his volunteer work. The kids were initially wary of him, but slowly, they began to warm up. He learned their names, their favorite games, and the little quirks that made each of them unique. Tyler, the boy who had confronted him during his first apology, was a natural leader on the basketball court. His determination was infectious, and James found himself rooting for him during every pickup game. Then there was Samantha, a shy girl who spent most of her time drawing in a corner of the center. James made a point to compliment her sketches, and over time, she started sharing her work with him, her eyes lighting up with pride. James also struck up conversations with the parents who frequented the center. He listened to their stories about long work hours, financial struggles, and the challenges of raising kids in a world that often felt stacked against them. Each conversation chipped away at the walls he had built around himself, opening his eyes to a reality he had long ignored. One afternoon, during a particularly heated basketball game, Tyler approached James during a break. He held the ball under his arm, his face serious. "Mr. Walker," he said, his tone hesitant, "why do you keep coming here?" James blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Tyler shrugged. "I mean, you didn't like us at first. You called the cops on us. So why are you helping now?" James sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Because I was wrong, Tyler," he said simply. "I judged you without knowing you. And that's not fair. I'm trying to make up for it." Tyler studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay," he said, "but you still owe me a one-on-one game." James chuckled, the tension breaking. "You're on, kid." The next Saturday, James found himself on the court with Tyler. The other kids gathered around to watch. The rules were simple: first to 5 points. James hadn't played basketball in years, and it showed. Tyler darted around him with ease, sinking shots with a confidence that made the crowd cheer. By the end of the game, James was breathless and sweaty, but he couldn't stop smiling. Tyler extended a hand to help him up, his grin wide. "You're not too bad for an old guy," Tyler said, his voice teasing. James laughed, shaking his head. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the kids dispersed, James sat on the edge of the court, watching them with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he felt like he belonged, not just to the youth center, but to the community as a whole. That evening, Hannah stopped by the house. She found James sitting on the porch, a cup of tea in his hands and a peaceful expression on his face. "You look different," she said, taking a seat beside him. James smiled. "I feel different." Hannah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I've been hearing things," she said. "Good things. The kids like you. The parents trust you. Even Ms. Carter can't stop talking about how much you've helped." James looked down at his cup, feeling a surge of emotion. "I've learned a lot," he said quietly. "About the kids, about the neighborhood, and about myself." Hannah reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said. "I know it wasn't easy, but you're making a real difference." James swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, Hannah. You pushed me to see things I didn't want to see. And now, I don't ever want to go back." With the basketball tournament just weeks away, James threw himself into the preparations. He worked closely with Ms. Carter and the kids, organizing schedules, securing sponsors, and even helping to repaint the court. The day of the tournament arrived, and the youth center was buzzing with excitement. Families gathered on the sidelines, cheering as the kids played their hearts out. James watched from the sidelines, a clipboard in hand and a smile on his face. When Tyler's team won the final game, the crowd erupted into cheers. Tyler ran over to James, holding up the small trophy they had awarded to the winners. "This is for you, Mr. Walker," Tyler said, his voice filled with pride. James shook his head, his eyes misty. "No, Tyler, this is for you, all of you. You've taught me more than I could ever teach you." After the success of the basketball tournament, James's involvement in the community deepened. He had become a familiar face at the youth center, not just as a volunteer but as a mentor. The kids often came to him with questions, not just about basketball or school, but about life. His honesty and humility resonated with them, and slowly, their initial skepticism gave way to trust. One evening, as James was tidying up after a workshop on teamwork, Ms. Carter approached him with a thoughtful expression. "You've become quite the fixture around here," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "The kids look up to you." James paused, surprised. "I'm just trying to make up for my mistakes." Ms. Carter smiled, shaking her head. It's more than that. You've shown them what it means to grow. To admit when you're wrong and work to make things right. That's a lesson most people never learn. Her words stayed with James long after she left. He had started this journey with the hope of making amends. But now, he realized it was about more than just fixing the past. It was about building a better future, not just for himself, but for the kids, for Hannah, and for the community as a whole. Despite his progress at the youth center, James knew there was still work to be done. Many of his neighbors, particularly the newer families, still viewed him with caution. They remembered the call that had brought the police to the basketball court. And trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. James decided to take a bold step, hosting a neighborhood gathering at his house. With Hannah's help, he spent days preparing. They cleaned up the yard, painted the porch, and set up tables with food and drinks. When the day arrived, James stood at the gate, greeting each guest with a mixture of nervousness and hope. At first, the atmosphere was stiff. Neighbors clustered in small groups, talking quietly and avoiding eye contact with James. But as the afternoon wore on, the ice began to melt. Kids played games on the lawn. Parents exchanged stories, and laughter slowly filled the air. James moved from group to group, listening more than he spoke. He heard stories about the struggles and triumphs of his neighbors, learning more about their lives in a few hours than he had in the years they'd lived near him. By the end of the day, the atmosphere had transformed. As people began to leave, several neighbors approached James to thank him. "This was a great idea," one woman said, shaking his hand. "It's good to see you getting involved." James nodded, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. That evening, after the last guest had left, James and Hannah sat on the porch, the glow of string lights casting a warm glow over the yard. "You did good today, Dad," Hannah said, her voice soft. "You brought people together." James looked out at the empty street, his heart full but heavy. "I just wish I'd done it sooner," he said quietly. "I wasted so many years hiding behind my walls. And for what?" Hannah placed a hand on his arm, her expression gentle. "You can't change the past. But you've changed now, and that's what matters." James nodded, his eyes misty. I don't want to let anyone down." "You won't," Hannah said firmly. "Because you're not doing this for them. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do." A few weeks later, James was approached by Marcus Evans, a community organizer who had attended the neighborhood gathering. Marcus had been impressed by James's transformation and invited him to join a local initiative focused on mentoring at-risk youth. James hesitated at first. The idea of stepping into a leadership role felt daunting, but Hannah encouraged him to accept. "You've already been doing the work," she said. "This is just the next step." James agreed, and over the next few months, he found himself working closely with Marcus and a team of volunteers. Together, they organized workshops, secured funding for programs, and advocated for better resources for the youth center. It was hard work, but it was also deeply fulfilling. James felt a renewed sense of purpose. And with each passing day, he became more confident in his ability to make a difference. Through it all, James's relationship with Hannah continued to grow. They spent more time together, sharing meals, attending events, and even working on community projects side by side. One evening, as they were sorting through flyers for an upcoming fundraiser, Hannah looked up at her father with a smile. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said. "You've come so far." James looked at her, his chest tightening with emotion. "I wouldn't have made it here without you," he said. "You pushed me to see things I didn't want to see. And I'll never stop being grateful for that." Hannah reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "You did the work, Dad, and you've shown me, and everyone else, that it's never too late to change." Months turned into a year, and James's impact on the neighborhood was undeniable. The youth center flourished, the kids thrived, and the community grew stronger. James had become a mentor, a friend, and an advocate, not because he sought recognition, but because he had learned the value of showing up, listening, and taking responsibility. One evening, as he stood on the porch, watching the kids play basketball under the glow of streetlights, James felt a deep sense of peace. He wasn't the man he used to be. And for the first time in his life, he was proud of the person he had become. James's role in the mentoring initiative grew steadily. As part of the program, he was paired with Desmond, a quiet 14-year-old who struggled to stay engaged in school. Desmond's mother, a single parent juggling two jobs, had been worried about his grades and his tendency to keep to himself. She was relieved to learn about the program and hopeful that James could help. At first, Desmond was reserved, responding to James's attempts at conversation with little more than nods and shrugs. But James didn't give up. He started small, helping Desmond with his math homework, talking about his own struggles as a kid, and even inviting him to help repaint the basketball court as part of a community beautification project. One afternoon, as they took a break from painting, Desmond finally opened up. "You're not like other adults," he said, surprising James. "Most of them just tell me what to do. But you listen." James smiled, his heart swelling. "That's because I've made my own mistakes, Desmond," he said, "and I've learned that listening is how we grow. You got a lot to say, kid. I just want to hear it." From that day on, their bond deepened. Desmond began to thrive, not just academically but socially as well. He joined the youth center's basketball team, made new friends, and even started tutoring younger kids in math, something James couldn't have imagined when they first met. One of the most unexpected outcomes of James's journey was his friendship with Eleanor Sanchez, a longtime neighbor he had barely spoken to before. Eleanor, a retired teacher in her 70s, had been skeptical of James after the incident with the kids, but when she saw him volunteering at the youth center and attending community meetings, her opinion began to shift. Their friendship began one morning when James noticed Eleanor struggling to carry groceries up her porch steps. Without hesitation, he crossed the street to help. "Thank you," she said, slightly out of breath. "I suppose I owe you an apology. I misjudged you." James chuckled, shaking his head. "You're not the only one who's done that around here," he said. "I'm just trying to make up for my own mistakes." Eleanor invited him in for tea, and over time, their conversations became a regular occurrence. She shared stories of her years as a teacher, and James confided in her about his efforts to change. Their friendship became a source of strength for both of them, a reminder that bridges could be built even when they seemed impossible. One evening, James was invited to speak at a town hall meeting about the progress of the mentoring initiative. The room was packed, and as he stood at the podium, he felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his chest. But then he saw Hannah in the crowd, her encouraging smile steadying him. "I used to think that change wasn't possible," James began, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "I thought people were who they were, and that was that. But the truth is, we all have the capacity to grow. We just have to be willing to face the hard truths about ourselves." He went on to share his story, how his assumptions and fears had led him to make a mistake, and how the people in the neighborhood, especially the kids, had taught him what it meant to be part of a community. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, applause began to build until it filled the space. James stepped back from the podium, his chest tight with gratitude and pride. After the meeting, James and Hannah walked back to his house together. The streets were quiet, the air cool and crisp. Hannah looped her arm through his, a contented smile on her face. "You did good tonight, Dad," she said. "Really good." James nodded, his heart full. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Hannah. You pushed me to see the world differently, and I'll always be grateful for that." They reached his porch and sat down, the soft glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the yard. For a moment, they sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. "You know," James said finally, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think this neighborhood was changing in ways I didn't like. But now I see it's changing in the best way possible. And I'm lucky to be part of it." Hannah smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We're all lucky, Dad." As the months turned into another year, James continued his work with the mentoring initiative and the youth center. He helped organize more events, advocated for better resources at city council meetings, and even took on the role of coaching the youth basketball team. The transformation in the neighborhood was palpable. The basketball court became a vibrant hub of activity, a place where kids, parents, and neighbors came together to connect and support one another. James often found himself at the center of it all, not because he sought recognition, but because his actions had earned the community's trust and respect. One evening, after a particularly lively basketball game, Tyler approached James with a smile. "You've changed a lot, Mr. Walker," he said, his tone both teasing and sincere. "You're like, part of the family now." James laughed, ruffling Tyler's hair. "Thanks, kid, that means more than you know." On the anniversary of the basketball tournament, the neighborhood gathered at the youth center for a celebration. There was music, food, and plenty of laughter as families and friends reflected on how far they had come. As James looked around at the crowd, he felt a profound sense of peace. He wasn't the man he had been when this journey began, and he was grateful for that. He had learned that change wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. And every small step he had taken had brought him to this moment. Standing beside him, Hannah squeezed his hand. "You did it, Dad," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You've become the man I always knew you could be." James smiled, his heart full. "We did it," he said, "together." As the celebration continued into the evening, James felt a quiet but powerful hope for the future. A future where second chances were embraced, where community was valued, and where the journey toward understanding and growth never truly ended. James's second year of involvement with the youth center and the mentoring initiative brought new challenges and opportunities. The program expanded to include workshops on leadership and conflict resolution, and James became one of the primary facilitators. The workshops were an eye-opener for James. He found himself learning as much as he taught, particularly during discussions led by the kids. They spoke candidly about their lives, sharing struggles and hopes that reminded James of the resilience he had underestimated when he first called the police on them. One day, during a workshop on building trust, Tyler raised his hand. "Trust isn't just about saying sorry," he said, glancing at James. "It's about showing up, over and over, even when it's hard." James smiled, recognizing the wisdom in Tyler's words. "You're absolutely right," he said, "and trust me, you've all taught me what that really means." The kids laughed, and James felt a wave of gratitude. They had every reason to hold a grudge against him, but instead, they had welcomed him into their world. Their forgiveness wasn't just a gift, it was a lesson. Inspired by the success of the mentoring program, James and Marcus began working on a new initiative, a scholarship fund for local youth. They reached out to local businesses and organized fundraisers, including bake sales, car washes, and community talent shows. The response was overwhelming. The neighborhood rallied around the cause, donating money, time, and resources. By the end of the first fundraiser, they had raised enough to provide scholarships for 3 students. One of the recipients was Samantha, the shy artist James had befriended at the youth center. She planned to use the scholarship to attend an art summer camp, an opportunity she had once thought impossible. When Samantha received the award, she hugged James tightly. "Thank you," she said, tears in her eyes. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." James felt a lump in his throat. "You did all the hard work, Samantha," he said. "I just helped clear the path." While James was busy with his community work, Hannah found herself reflecting on her own journey. Watching her father grow had inspired her to take stock of her own life. She decided to apply for a leadership role at the nonprofit where she worked, a position she had hesitated to pursue in the past. During her interview, she spoke passionately about the importance of second chances and the power of community. "I've seen how much people can change when they're given the right support," she said, "and I want to be part of creating those opportunities for others." A week later, she received the job offer. When she shared the news with James, his pride was unmistakable. "You're going to do amazing things, Hannah," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You already have." One evening, as James and Hannah were having dinner, there was a knock at the door. To their surprise, it was Eleanor, the retired teacher who had become one of James's closest friends. She had brought a photo album filled with pictures of the neighborhood over the years. "I thought you might like to see this," she said, setting the album on the table. "It's a reminder of how much this place has changed, and how much it stayed the same." As they flipped through the pages, James was struck by the faces in the photos, families, children, and neighbors who had shaped the community. Some were familiar, while others were long gone, but each one had left a mark. "I used to think I didn't belong here," James admitted, his voice soft, "but now I see this neighborhood isn't just a place. It's the people, and I'm lucky to be part of it." Eleanor smiled, patting his hand. "You've always belonged, James. You just needed to let yourself see it." One summer evening, The youth center held its annual gala to celebrate the accomplishments of the kids and volunteers. James attended as a guest, unaware that he was about to be honored. As the evening progressed, Ms. Carter took the stage. "Tonight, we want to recognize someone who has gone above and beyond to support our kids and our community," she said. "This person has shown us that change is not just possible, it's powerful." She called James's name, and the room erupted into applause. Stunned, James made his way to the stage, his heart pounding. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice trembling. "I don't deserve this. I'm just trying to make things right." "You've done more than that," Ms. Carter said, handing him a plaque. "You've inspired all of us." As James looked out at the crowd, he saw Hannah smiling through tears. The kids cheered loudly, their faces beaming with pride. It was a moment James would carry with him forever. The next morning, James sat on his porch, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The basketball court across the street was alive with activity. Kids laughing and playing as the sun rose higher in the sky. Hannah joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She sat down beside him, handing him one of the mugs. "You've come a long way, Dad," she said, her voice warm. James nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "We both have." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood come to life. For James, it wasn't just a new day, it was a new chapter. One filled with hope, connection, and the understanding that change was a journey, not a destination. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. Years later, the basketball court that had once been a source of division became a symbol of unity. The scholarship fund grew, the youth center expanded, and the neighborhood thrived. James, now in his 60s, remained deeply involved. He mentored new volunteers, offered guidance to parents, and continued to be a fixture at every basketball game. Hannah's nonprofit work flourished, and she often credited her father for inspiring her to dream bigger. Together, they became champions for their community, proving that change wasn't just possible, it was transformative. As James watched the next generation take the court, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had found his place in the world, not by holding on to the past, but by embracing the future. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter and hope, he knew the journey had been worth it.